these laws making e-cigarettes harder for kids to access increases their cigarette use. So that's the opposite direction of what the gateway relationship would predict.
Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. U.S. President Joe Biden is inching closer to the passage of his signature social spending plan, the Build Back Better Act, which pumps nearly $2 trillion into the expansion of the social safety net and turbocharges climate change policy. But to pay for the plan, the Biden administration aims to build back better on the backs of former smokers with a new excise tax on safer nicotine products, a tax which public health experts say could drive millions of people back to smoking. Joining us today on RegWatch to discuss the potential impact of the new tax is Dr. Michael Pesko, Associate Professor of Economics at Georgia State University and one of the country's leading economists when it comes to analyzing the effect of e-cigarette taxes. Dr. Pesko, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Before we dive into your background and research on e-cigarettes, tell our viewers top line what you think of the proposed new tax on nicotine vaping products. Could this be a public health disaster in the making?
Yes, it could be a public health disaster. Our research, which is NIH, a National Institutes of Health funded research, we find that it would cause a large substitution to combustible tobacco products across a variety of different populations, both teenagers, adults, pregnant women. It is effective in terms of reducing vaping. So there's both intended and unintended consequences of the policy. But with the unintended consequences likely outweighing any public health benefits that the taxes could have.
So it sounds truly scary.
We do estimate sizable effects of substitution, including for teenagers, for example. Oftentimes, these taxes are talked about as a way to protect kids. We find that about 2 in every 3 kids that stops vaping due to an e-cigarette tax, they smoke cigarettes instead. So we're talking in the United States, approximately 500,000 likely smokers that would not otherwise be smoking in the absence of the e-cigarette tax.
Now, teens, that's incredible.
Yeah, there's this, the substitution estimates are even higher if you look at young adults, for example, 18 to 25. We estimate some of the highest rates of substitution within that population, certainly for adults as well. A lot of evidence of substitution. Basically, consumers, they make decisions about which tobacco products to use. If we kind of just take some of the passion out of the issue by let's not talk about e-cigarettes or cigarettes. Let's just talk about generic tobacco products, numbers 1 through 10. What would we anticipate to happen if we took one of those random products and we drastically increased the price on it? I guess I would anticipate that some individuals, they would fall out of the tobacco marketplace altogether. Other individuals, then they would move from using that higher priced product to one of the other 9 available tobacco products. And so given substitution is likely, it's important to try to cause that substitution among the most lethal of the products that are available on the marketplace, right? And so this would be combustible products, cigarettes and cigars. So the idea to increase that price so dramatically for one of some of the safer products, whether vaping products or smokeless tobacco products, and then causing that substitution to the more lethal products, that doesn't make a lot of sense from a public health perspective, to say it kindly.
You mentioned to remove the emotion out of it. Why is there so much emotion around this?
Well, that's a good question. I think that there are a lot of people that are rightfully concerned about nicotine use among kids and do want to have the good intention of wanting to protect kids from becoming nicotine addicted. So I think that's where a lot of this passion drives from. I think, one issue that has always concerned me, I don't hear a lot of other people talking about it, is just how easy it is for teenagers to access tobacco from retail environments, for example, whether cigarettes, E-cigarettes actually, it's kids don't get their e-cigarettes as regularly from retail environments as they do cigarettes. But as long as the regulatory kind of the inspections of the retail environments, that kind of thing, is just really not adequate to make it so that it's not profitable for store owners to keep selling tobacco products to kids, right? I mean, occasionally, at least in the United States, they might occasionally get fined. They might occasionally come into some low level of trouble, but it's not enough to take away the profit incentive of selling tobacco to kids, right? And so as long as that remains and there's not rigorous enough compliance check inspections to stop kids from accessing tobacco, people kind of throw their hands up in the air and they're like, we need to protect our kids. What do we do? And e-cigarette taxes they think is a way to do that, not fully realizing some of the unintended consequences of it. So there are easier ways to get at this issue that we all can agree on, that we don't want kids using tobacco, right? But I think the way to do that is to focus in on the profit incentive shop owners have to sell to kids, and to make it so that that's not profitable, in which case we wouldn't need this e-cigarette tax that's likely to cause a lot of public health harm.
Right. So let's just talk a bit about the tax here. Now, it's expected that this tax is going to pass the House sometime later this week, maybe Saturday or early next week. And then it's apparently going to pass the Senate. That's the plan, by Christmas. So if that's the case, this tax, as a part of this large, huge, almost $2 trillion spending plan, would then go into effect sometime around June. Now, the tax is intended to raise about $9 billion, but what's interesting is that at one point, this tax was supposed to be applied to cigarettes as well. There was supposed to be some tax impact here, but now what we find is that cigarettes are exempt, so are all of the other nicotine products that have been approved by the FDA for smoking cessation, which pretty much just leaves e-cigarettes and, some of the smaller products that are also in the safer nicotine category. How does this work when cigarettes aren't getting an increase in tax and this massive tax is being dumped onto vaping? Yeah,
it's unfortunate that basically as Congress has been debating this, the bill seems to have gotten worse, right? You hope that debate leads to a better bill. In this case, it seems to be working in the opposite direction. I am still hopeful that the congressmen and women, they will. We're trying to educate them on what we think the public health consequences of this tax will be. I hope that they're receptive to the information that we're trying to share, and I wouldn't call that a foregone conclusion that the House passes, although I do agree with you. I think it's likely. I feel better. I feel there are more senators that have acknowledged the benefits that e-cigarettes and smokeless tobacco products have as harm reduction products, and have stated publicly that they oppose the tax. Similarly, we're trying to get information into their hands so that they know what our studies suggest the effects of these taxes will be in terms of increasing combustible use. So I hope that's something that they're willing to fight on, because that is a very important issue to a lot of people. So I don't know. So I'm hopeful that the bill doesn't pass. The tax doesn't pass. I am in favor of my preferred regulatory approach is I think we should just tax products proportionate to risk, which is approach that's gotten a lot of support. Has been published. That perspective has been published twice in the New England Journal of Medicine, to tax proportionate to risk. Recently, 15 former presidents for the Society for Research on Nicotine Tobacco, which is one of the world's leading professional organization for multidisciplinary researchers that study the effects of tobacco. They also endorsed the call to have a small e-cigarette tax, but oppose kind of trying to make e-cigarette tax proportionate to the cigarette tax. So I think that a small e-cigarette tax I am in favor of, but the idea of trying to set a e-cigarette tax at the same level as a more lethal product, and possibly even at a higher level, depending on how you look at it, that's public health disaster in the making. And so the focus the focus should be as on raising that combustible tobacco tax more. Why do we need even? That should be the first focus. And I've actually even heard that echoed by Matt Myers, believe it or not, who I disagree with often from the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids. He's also said the same thing, that he thinks the combustible tax should be the first thing that's focused on. So, legislators, they have a chance to heed the advice of people from a wide swath of different opinions on this issue. Go for the combustible, which is also where the revenue is too, not on e-cigarettes and smokeless products.
Right. Now, before we dive in more deeply here into some of the issues and to discuss this letter that you actually wrote to Congress, which we'll bring up in a minute, I'd like to actually have you share with our viewers some of your background, because it's not often that we get economists on the show talking so knowledgeably about e-cigarettes, harm reduction, of course, taxes, that's your bailiwick. How is it that you got to this topic? And share with us a little bit about the research. I know you're quite well published.
I guess, I think I would have to go back to talking about myself growing up to answer that question. I guess my kind of main exposure to tobacco was I worked at a fast food restaurant, like a lot of teenagers used to do back when. And I remember all the high school students being in the break room smoking their cigarettes and already being addicted. And I wasn't a tobacco user, but I remember being very interested in how did this happen? And I remember feeling a lot of compassion for people that teenagers and some of the younger adults that I worked with that were addicted, and they didn't seem capable of quitting, and seeing how much money they were spending, especially on their tobacco products. So I kind of carried that perspective with me. And when I was in graduate school, I had the chance to get involved with some tobacco research. And so I think I jumped at that, recognizing that this is an issue that obviously affects a lot of people's lives quite substantially. So I worked with Frank Chalupka, who's also one of the world's leading economics experts on tobacco at University of Illinois Chicago, where I did my PhD studies. I then worked at the Centers for Disease Control for a year while finishing my dissertation. And at that point, that's when I really first started hearing about e-cigarettes. This was in 2011. And this was just starting to become a real conversation within the public health space. So just tried to slowly build a research agenda around that, and was very fortunate to receive funding from the National Institutes of Health to continue this work and providing an economics lens to these questions. I think economics is just a great way to view the world and to provide advice on how to set optimal policy, recognizing that any policy has both intended and unintended consequences. I think that's what the strength that economics really provides. Nowhere is that more obvious than with e-cigarettes.
Sometimes it's been noted that government tend to not actually take consequences into factor when they're coming up with all of these taxes and plans.
Well, that seems apparent with the current e-cigarette tax debate, for sure.
So last week, early November, so just last week, in fact, you wrote a letter to Congress, and this is it here, Dear Congress, members of Congress letter, and fill our viewers in on what you're trying to communicate with this letter.
Well, I think it's important that research, it be used in policymaking, right? The National Institutes of Health, they encourage, their researchers that they fund to educate lawmakers, somewhat. I am always a little bit nervous about sending these kinds of letters, because I have heard that sometimes congressmen and women don't appreciate these letters, and they try to interfere with your research agenda as a result and your funding as a result. But nevertheless, I think it's an important duty as a beneficiary of this funding. And if I have knowledge to share that's important, useful for a debate, I should do everything I can to get that knowledge into the hands of legislators. So that was really my purpose, was strictly from an educational a perspective, and I think I've come to this issue with the open mind, and I've been quite surprised at how strong the evidence of substitution is between e-cigarettes and cigarettes. Basically, this body of work is formed by by mid-2019, there were 10 states and 2 large counties that had adopted these taxes with very sizable magnitudes of the taxes. California, Washington, D.C., Minnesota taxes being very large taxes. Some states having very small taxes like North Carolina and Kansas. Other states, the majority of them not having any tax at all, right? And so we do have some nice variation. We have about a decade of data to then study, what effect did these state level taxes have. And that's very helpful then to informing what we could expect the federal tax to have should that come into law.
You emphasize several times in this letter that this is science-based analysis. Why the importance of emphasizing that, and why so many times is it needed to emphasize that with members of Congress?
I think that there's a lot of passion, on this issue, and I'm trying to come at it from a different perspective. I'm a numbers guy, right? I try to leave any passion behind. I don't think there's room for that in academic research, and so I was hoping that by just expressing my desire to educate, showing what the government itself has funded, putting that into the hands of legislators. I also happen to believe that, the statistical models that economists use are very strong models. So I really think that me and my colleagues, I think we do provide a really useful a framework for thinking about tobacco by not having it be a passionate thing, just having it be a numbers thing. And I think that is somewhat scarce in tobacco research, unfortunately, where there are a lot of researchers that are also very passionate in what they do. So I thought that might be a useful way to differentiate what information that they're getting from other sources, and hopefully it was an effective strategy.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's certainly, I think that it's fair to say that this could be considered an explosive letter. I know that some of our colleagues at RegWatch, in the media, at Reason and so forth, have used that terminology. You communicate 4 key points here to Congress, and I've got them up on some slides. We can talk each one individually. I've got them in a different order than you put them. So here's the first one that we have. And the Biden vape tax, of course, public health impact. And you have 5.5 extra packs of cigarettes are sold for every 1 e-cigarette pod eliminated by an e-cigarette tax. What does that mean?
As expected, the tax is currently debated by Congress. That would indeed reduce e-cigarette sales quite substantially. But then the question is, what effect does it have in the cigarette marketplace, right? And that's where we find that the e-cigarette tax increases cigarette sales. And so if we took then the reduction in e-cigarette sales and compare that to the increase in e-cigarette to cigarette packs sold, we said that we assume that a pod is equivalent to 0.7 fluid milliliters. And so for each 0.7 fluid milliliter pod, the standard Juul pod, that is eliminated as a result of the tax, 5.5 packs of cigarettes are sold instead.
So so if they're trying to get people to stop using e-cigarettes and stop smoking at the same time, that doesn't sound very effective.
No, clearly not. The numbers didn't look that bad when it was they were considering doubling the cigarette tax at the same time, right? Although still bad, right? So it's even worse now. Clearly no. I mean, enacting e-cigarette only tax is going to cause more cigarette use, however at any level, right? And so I think the main focus should be raising the combustible tax. Why don't we just double that? Standalone, double the cigarette tax, triple the cigarette tax. Any of those options, then that would push the substitution into the vaping market, into the smokeless market, where people are less likely to die. So that's that's why it's kind of irrational to just raise it on the safer product and push cause substitution into the more lethal marketplaces.
All right, Mike, let's go to point 2 now from your letter. Again, a potential impact from this new vaping tax, this new nicotine tax. For every 3 pregnant women that do not use an e-cigarette due to an e-cigarette tax, 1 smokes cigarettes instead.
Yeah. So again, this is another estimate of kind of the substitution, relationship, right? What is the trade-off, right? So this is kind of putting, taking numbers, in which we calculate both the effect of the e-cigarette tax on prenatal vaping. We use a survey data source for this, the Pregnancy Risk Assessment Monitoring System data. And that gives us kind of our first stage relationship, right? And then of course we're interested in also in the effect of the e-cigarette tax then on prenatal smoking. And we generate that from national birth record data. We have very good information in the United States. 40 million births a year. 4 million births a year, and each birth, we have information on the women's smoking pre-pregnancy and each of the 3 trimesters. So we have really cool panel data, large number of observations, and there we see kind of the positive effect that the e-cigarette tax has on increasing prenatal smoking. We compare those 2 estimates. What's the prenatal vaping reduction and the prenatal smoking increase? That's how we generate the 1 pregnant woman smokes for every 3 that stops vaping.
Let's jump into the third point now that you presented to members of Congress. This is a big one. And again, this is back to the teen. So you mentioned this right at the start of the interview. Teen e-cigarette use would drop by 2.7%. So that sounds good. But 2 out of 3 teens who would not vape due to the tax would smoke cigarettes instead. And that equals 500,000 extra teen smokers. That's incredible.
The hypothesized direction is some teens, they're smoking and they want to quit, right? I think teenagers, they benefit from harm reduction, just like adults benefit from harm reduction. I think a lot of people disagree with that. But there are teens that smoke and they don't want to. And so, they deserve, I think, access to products that can help them to quit. And the other flip side of that then is that a lot of these teens are addicted to nicotine, right? And so they're going to need to either get over their addiction to nicotine, or they're going to need to find another product that satiates their demand for nicotine. And so if we raise the tax on e-cigarettes and smokeless products, that's really only leaving combustibles, I guess, as an available option that the price of which wasn't being changed.
Is this just teens that were currently smoking before they used e-cigarettes and they'd go back to smoking? Or are we talking about just the sheer fact that they're going to be so priced out of reach that, teens that are just entering into experimentation instead of maybe going down the vaping route and thus never touching combustible, or are they going into cigarettes directly?
Yeah, I think you're going to see a combination of both, unfortunately, right? And I think that latter is particularly sad, in which a teenager that develops some level of addiction, possibly for nicotine, that they might not have used cigarettes otherwise if they just could continue to access their e-cigarette product without those kind of price restrictions. I think you would see some of those individuals migrate to smoking that would have otherwise not smoked absent the tax. Is
vaping a gateway to combustibles, to smoking? Or because if it's not, then boy, this finding is very troubling.
Yeah, it is not a gateway. this kind of gets into the weeds on different kind of methodological approaches that scientists use, right? And I noticed that you just pulled up that paper where we re-examined the relationship, between teenage cigarette and e-cigarette use, and we sharply criticized in this paper a 2016 Surgeon General report. They surveyed these longitudinal cohort studies that basically these studies then they take tobacco naive people, and then they follow them over time, and then at some point, some of these youth then, for example, that were tobacco naive, they might have used an e-cigarette, and so then it tries to see, well, what is your propensity then in the next period to use a cigarette compared to the teens in that period of time that did not use the e-cigarette? What was their propensity to use a cigarette, right? You might say, well, obviously the e-cigarette user, those types of kids that would have used an e-cigarette initially, those are the same types of kids that might use a cigarette. And in fact, maybe they were going to go for the cigarette, but the e-cigarette was just so, it was safer. Why not test the waters kind of first with the safer product before going to the more risky product, which is the product you would have gone for anyways, right? So needless to say, these studies, they show evidence that the kids that use e-cigarettes are more likely to use cigarettes in the subsequent period. Does that suggest it's a gateway? Of course not, because for a lot of those kids, they would have used cigarettes anyways, had the e-cigarette not been there. And so you really need to use kind of a natural, you can't rely on self-selection for these kinds of studies because you're going to get all kinds of bias, and it really can't, anything you estimate is just going to basically be driven by the self-selection. So what we as economists try to use are natural experiment methods in which we take advantage of policy changes. And actually, three economists that really pioneered some of the statistical methods that we use in natural experiment research, they just won the Nobel Prize in economics. So a lot of us reduced form microeconomists that run these types of models, we are very happy to see that we didn't win the Nobel, but we're happy to see one of our own whose work we borrow from in our own models, that they were acknowledged with such a great way. But the natural experiment methodology, then kind of by relying on it gets closer to the randomized controlled trial, right? Which is very nice, and there are a lot of randomized controlled trial studies in England, for example, and they find that the e-cigarettes are about twice as effective as nicotine replacement therapy in helping people to quit. And these randomized controlled trials, basically, people are recruited and then they're randomized. Do you get nicotine gum? Do you get an e-cigarette? And then followed to see what effect it has on the smoking cessation. The natural experiments, we try to mimic the same thing, but we say, okay, some people get the tax, some people don't get the tax. Let's now see what effect does this have on their subsequent smoking. We call that quasi-random variation, right? And you really need either randomization or quasi-randomization, to generate anything that should be used by in policymaking. And when we do that when we use natural experiments, we find that in contrast to what the Surgeon General promoted, they relied on all these faulty longitudinal cohort studies. We find the natural experiment methodology, if we take data from that same period of time, we just analyze it using available price and tax changes, which is what we had. Abby Friedman and I have shown using minimum legal purchase age laws, as well as the kind of the policy variation, same relationship, that these laws making e-cigarettes harder for kids to access increases their cigarette use. So that's the opposite direction of what the gateway relationship would predict, right? So we find evidence, basically it's a displacement product. And so it really goes to show the dangers of using subpar kind of methodologies in research, and how the Surgeon General especially should be more careful in what types of studies they promote, because it can, if they're not careful, it can cause them to form the wrong conclusions.
Now let's move to the final point in your letter to members of Congress, and that was, if this tax gets implemented, adult smokers would increase by 2.5 million nationally, while adult vapors would decrease by similar amount.
Yeah, so we find high rates of substitution within the adult population within the young adult population as well. That particular statistic was for people under 40 years, so adults under 40. A little bit more nebulous for older adults. But yeah, again, I mean, adults are benefiting from e-cigarettes in terms of helping them to reduce their cigarette use and possibly even quit. And so if we push on the e-cigarette prices by increasing those, that's going to push people out of e-cigarette use. Some adults will stop vaping, obviously, but those numbers suggest almost all of them then to go right into back to smoking. So that's not a positive public health outcome.
No, I mean, it seems to be opposite of the total goal here, which is to reduce smoking prevalence.
Right. Well, I think that should be the goal. I think some people would disagree, and they think that some public health groups, it's their stated goal actually to reduce nicotine use, which I think is a dangerous public health goal, because the focus should be on let's end combustible tobacco. I think that's a feasible goal. But people demand nicotine because they like nicotine, right? So I don't think we're ever going to rid the world of nicotine. So that goal is an unfeasible goal. We should be focusing on what's feasible, and that's, I think, to end combustible use and to substantially reduce tobacco-related disease and death. I think we can get that close to zero if we just keep focusing on making safer tobacco products and letting, not regulating the hell out of them, right? I think that's the way to end the tobacco pandemic that is 100 years in the making.
Now, I mean, it seems to me that driving 2.5 million U.S. adults under 40 back to smoking is a disaster. Yeah,
I think so. I mean, it's going to raise the smoking rate. I mean, these people are, going to be more likely to suffer all the adverse consequences of smoking that are well documented. I think approximately 10-year expected less life expectancy. I mean, 1 in 5 adults they die from tobacco even today, and so we're just perpetuating and exacerbating those well-documented problems of combustible tobacco use.
I just struggle with trying to understand how it is that more people that you're trying to influence, I guess, or at least communicate to, aren't getting this picture.
Well, I think it goes back to people are really concerned about kids, right? And I mean, it's not just tobacco where perhaps people are irrationally kind of concerned about, child safety. I mean, there's been a lot of changes, I think, just in broader society, just in terms of not letting your kids play outside anymore. Being car seats need to be replaced every 2 years. I mean, you can find all kinds of examples of where people are very concerned about child health, right? And so I think that some groups they kind of feed on parents' concern about their kids to just focus on that, and let's ignore, I guess, adults, right? But I mean, even if you do that, though, still, I mean, the e-cigarette taxes are still hurting kids, I think, overall by, raising their combustible use. There could be a discrepancy as well between who has the time to actually pay attention to this issue, right? I mean, I think smoking is primarily a, low socioeconomic status activity, right? These people have very little political agency. They don't really, have time to, even if they're benefiting from e-cigarettes, they don't have time to tell their legislators about that, right? Whereas, wealthier people, they might see no benefit of e-cigarettes and only as a threat to their children, because e-cigarettes are being used more in schools and that kind of thing. And these are the people that have the time to get involved with different advocacy organizations to write to their members of Congress. So I think that there is an interesting imbalance in who benefits and who has the time to advocate and lobby, and that could be causing some of what you're observing.
Flavor bans and major taxes, like those are the two killers. And that's what of industry killers. And that's really what we're seeing in Canada. We're seeing that in the US. Of course, you've got flavor bans, perpetuating around the country in certain areas. And of course, nationally, they want to have it. So, I mean, I don't even know what the right question is like, how much more? I think that maybe with your research, it's so clear that it's driving people back to smoking. I just don't know how that's acceptable.
I don't think it's acceptable. I think where the politicians are coming from, again, is who they're hearing from. And they're not hearing from the people that benefit from smoking. They're only hearing from the parents of kids that maybe, that family has no history of tobacco use, but now suddenly this kid is caught with the jewel. Those are the types of parents that Congress is hearing from. And so it's going to, I don't know how to change the calculus. I think that there are some advocacy organizations that are trying to raise more awareness on the tobacco harm reduction side. So that's one way to combat this issue. If people benefit from e-cigarettes, tell your legislators, right? Because you can be sure that the legislators are probably hearing from, for every one of you, there's probably 10 parents that, the legislators are already hearing from, right? So we do need to get people more willing to engage in the political process if they're benefiting from these products, right? So take the time and do that. I think that's I think then the politicians, they will be receptive, and I think we have seen some evidence of that with the tax bill. I've seen a lot of activity on Twitter and where people are mobilizing and trying to let the legislators know how these products benefit them, and I think some legislators are responding to that positively. And there are some legislators that really just care about the science too, I have to say. I especially at the state level, I think my letter has influenced some state. All it takes is one person on a committee to change their mind on the issue, and I have seen that happen based on just presenting science to them. So there are people that do try to govern in a very science-based fashion.
So there may be some hope then that this tax won't ever see the light of day.
I think so. Just let people know. I mean, just don't be silent on this issue. I mean, I think it's an important one. I think policymakers are going to make better decisions if they're hearing from a full cross section of American society and not just the wealthy and the affluent that have the time to do this historically.